Hey guys, this is Professor Vitt. Welcome to Critical Thinking. This is Philosophy 11. Here is my email address, rvitt@lbcc.edu. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. All right, let's head about here and start talking about critical thinking. Critical thinking is the title of this course, and critical thinking is really just thinking about thinking. In other words, it's to be a critical thinker is not just to be really smart or to know a lot of stuff. A critical thinker is someone who has taken the time to really look at how they're doing something so as to ensure that they're doing it right. Think about somebody who's maybe got a lot of natural talent at playing a guitar. Now, that person might get very far on their own. They might play beautiful music. They could even be an incredible musician, coveted throughout the world, but they wouldn't be as good a musician as if they had some formal training in the instrument. So it could be that the way that they're holding the instrument is wrong, or the way that they hold their fingers isn't perfect, but they have so much talent they can compensate for that. Thinking is a little bit like that. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how much computational power you have. If you're doing it wrong, you're just going to do it wrong, right? So you see this sometimes with athletes when they start professional sports. Their initial athleticism is really sufficient to carry them very far. But to get farther, to kind of move past that point, they have to understand the fundamentals of the game that they're playing. And that's very similar to thought. If you're not able to think in a proper way, you'll make all kinds of mistakes. And rather than go back and correct those mistakes, you will stick by them. It sounds crazy, I know, but it's actually correct. And part of this course is understanding how that will work. Now, when we are studying critical thinking, the way that we're going to do it in this course is to study the paranormal. And then the paranormal is something that violates the laws of physics or the laws of nature, anything that we know about matter and energy. So let me give you an example. We might study astrology in this course. We certainly will consider it as we progress through the book. We'll study people who claim to be psychic. We'll look at some cryptozoology claims, although those are not necessarily paranormal, but they might be depending upon how you think about it. And we'll also look at some conspiracy theories throughout history or American history. And we're still going to satisfy all of the student learning outcomes and the course outline of record and so forth for the state of California, but we're going to do it in a fun way. And I think this is generally a more interesting subject matter approach. And I also think there are really good reasons for studying the paranormal. One of which is because these paranormal claims do seem to violate what we know about the world. It's important that we treat them with great care because they may be trying to tell us something, right? If someone is psychic, then I want to know what's going on because it looks like, according to the science that we have, that the brain isn't set up to do that, right? It seems fairly connected to its neurological system and so forth. So I want to know what I don't know about perception. There are lots of reasons to study critical thinking per se. The first one being is that you are virtually always thinking on some level, right? As you move through your day, you're selecting lunch, you're making 100 decisions a day, and you are thinking as you do that. So anything that you're doing so frequently definitely deserves to be done properly. Also, how you think influences the decisions that you make, and so your daily life and the quality of your life. And you want, I assume, the quality of life to be as good as possible. And making good decisions helps you do that. And so studying critical thinking should, in fact, increase the quality of your life. Another important reason to study critical thinking is that we want to maximize our true beliefs, but we want to minimize the false ones that we have. So we have here, this is what we want, right? A mountain of true beliefs and a much smaller number of false ones. And unless we are able to think critically, we're going to have a tough time maximizing our true beliefs. Okay, and why study this? Just one last point. Large portions of our society believe in this stuff, right? I mean, it's very, very common for someone to have visited a psychic in their life, or believe in a ghost, or have a great ghost story, um, or believe in some form of parapsychological phenomena, whatever that is, poltergeist or psychic abilities or something like that. And lots of people believe in aliens and monsters of one sort or another. Um, and the book here also helps us out, talking about some reasons why we would study this stuff. If the paranormal is real and it violates what we know about the world already, then we better correct what we know about the world, right? I mean, if physics is wrong, then it's wrong, and we want to ditch it. Also, if people are able to do some of this stuff, like see ghosts, or they have a gift of second sight or something like that, well, that means that what we know about perception and human abilities is totally wrong. And we could use these abilities to enhance human decision making, just like we would use critical thinking to do that. It could, if someone did have a gift of second sight, they could use it to find someone, right? A missing child, perhaps. As a parent, that would be very important to me. If my child was missing, someone could locate him just by thinking about it, then that would be something I'd want to do. And then, of course, there are other things like, making money, right? You could buy stocks. If you knew, if you could see the future, then you would just pick a stock tomorrow that is going up and buy a lot of it and then sell it. Likewise, there are lots of lost treasures throughout the world, and if you could see things just by thinking about them, then you could locate some of those treasures and either give them to humanity or your critical thinking professor. Okay. Let's move on to the course toolkit. So this is kind of the shape that the course is going to take. When you are a critical thinker, you're going to first evaluate the sources. So where is this claim coming from? Whether or not the logic of a claim is proper, whether or not the observation that's involved in the claim is proper, and then lastly, whether or not there are any alternative hypotheses that could similarly explain the phenomena. Now, those alternative explanations are actually, when they get blown out, they're pretty big. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different, well, I guess I could have just looked right there. We have 5 different alternative explanation kind of maps that we'll look at. The oddity of nature, or large numbers. Is it an error in someone's perception, or someone committing fraud? Is there a memory error? Is this some type of placebo effect, or is this some kind of sensory anomaly or hallucination? So probably much of that is Greek, but I would know what these are for purposes of the exam. Okay, now I'm going to give you the Pocket Survival Kit. So this is something that gives you just a brief overview to think about as a critical thinker. And this is covered in 1 and 2. The Pocket Survival Kit has 2 parts to it. The first one is this general rule, which will be our mantra: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the second is going to be application of Occams Razor and something called Reductio ad absurdum. So this is very involved, I know, but let's take it one at a time. First up is the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now that sounds pretty cool, but it's not clear what it means. So let's take this example. Suppose I say Professor Vitt got to work by flapping his arms and flying through the sky. So I'm here in my office, right, and I didn't need to walk up the stairs to get here. I just flew in through the window by flapping my hands. Now that would be a pretty extraordinary claim, right? Because people aren't able to do that normally. Everything we know about physics and biology is that I cannot generate enough thrust with my legs in order to I can't generate enough lift with my hands in order to get off the ground, right? People don't normally fly by flapping their wings. So this would be an extraordinary claim someone's making, right? Now suppose when they tell you this story, and you say, well, I don't believe that. What's your evidence? And they say, well, I saw him do it. In other words, the only piece of evidence that they offer you is a story. Well, that's probably not going to be enough to make you believe that I actually am capable of getting to work by by flapping my arms. It's just not enough evidence. You'd say, well, I mean, anybody could say that they saw Professor Vitt flying like that. This is such an unusual thing. I would want better evidence or better proof or some proof in order to substantiate that claim. So suppose next we offer a video of me flying through the air and then, opening my office window as I'm flapping with one hand, and I open it up. Would that be good evidence? Well, it might be, but it's also, pretty likely that that could be photoshopped today with no sweat off anybody's back. So video probably won't be as good as we would like. So we're still kind of looking for something that might do this. Now we might look for some type of physical evidence of this. So this would depend on the circumstance, but we'd want something that we could touch. So it might be something like I was flying through the air and I wasn't watching where I was going, and I snapped a phone line. I just flew right through it, and I snapped it, and I broke down the telephone poles, right? That would be physical evidence that might help to establish my speed, how high I was, how quickly I was going, how much force I must be generating if I did snap the wire, depending upon their strength and so forth. So some physical evidence like that might be real good. But perhaps the best evidence might be if I could just do it whenever I needed to, right? If I could just replicate what I've done. So anytime somebody says, hey, Professor Vitt can fly, if I just flew and I showed everybody, that would be great, right? So if NASA really wanted me to do it, I would just do it. They could set up all their cameras, people could measure me, look at all this stuff, and I would just start to do it. And then that way, if I could independently replicate that feat for people, that would be much better evidence, right? So think about if I told you that, I said, oh yeah, I can fly just by flapping my wings, and you asked me, well, what's your evidence for that? And I said, well, I just told you I can do it. You'd say no. And then if I showed you a video, no, that wouldn't be any good. But if I actually did it, if I replicated the feat for you, well, then it would be a really good starting point, right? Because that would indicate, okay, this is something that I can verify myself. So an important point then is to notice it's related to this extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. The better the evidence you have, the more strength the conclusion has, right? So this is important. The weaker the evidence, the weaker the conclusion, but the stronger the evidence, the stronger your conclusion can be. So if you recall going through those 3 steps again, story, for purposes of me flying, not as good. Video, a little better, right? It might be tougher to fake it. We could at least examine the video, but still not as good. Best evidence, if I could just flap my wings whenever I need to prove to people that I can fly, then you could put a lot of confidence in that conclusion because I can do it whenever I'm asked to, right? Okay, now we're going to apply the second part of the critical thinking little toolkit there. We're going to look at Occam's Razor. And Occam's Razor is a fancy name for the following principle. The simplest explanation is the best. It's named after a medieval logician who ironically never mentioned it, but it sort of captures the spirit of his work, and so it's stuck with William of Occam. I would love to have that gig. I would love to have someone name some indispensable rule of thought after me, and I don't ever even formulate it, but that's beside the point. Okay, so Occam's Razor works like this. The simplest explanation is the best. Suppose you're sitting in your apartment in Long Beach or something, and you hear hooves outside the front door, like the sound of hooves. What are you going to think that is? We're going to think it's a horse, because there are more horses around Long Beach than there are zebras, unless there's something I really don't know. So the idea is the simpler explanation there is the horse, not the zebra. Now, if we were in another part of the world, or we were on a zebra reserve, then the simplest explanation would be the zebras. Notice that in that case, I'm just operating on a principle of thought. I'm not going outside to see what the hooves were. I'm just saying, gosh, when I think about it, I think hooves are the best explanation. The horse is the best explanation for what I hear, rather than a zebra. Okay, let's look at Occam's Razor in a different context. Suppose I hand you a, sorry, that was my Diet Coke. Suppose I hand you a deck of cards and I ask you to pick a card randomly out of the deck and remember it. So you pick a card out, it happens to be the King of Spades, and then I ask you to put the card back in the deck and shuffle it pretty extensively. So you do that. You remember the King of Spades, then you shuffle and you do that, whatever it is, peanut butter and jelly, whatever that's called when you put the cards together, and then you shuffle them more and you just shuffle them for a long time, then you hand me the cards back. And I say, okay, let me think about this, and all of a sudden I pull from the deck the exact King of Spades there, and you say, oh my gosh, how did you do it? You don't know how I did it, but you know that I was somehow able to figure out which card you were looking at, but I never saw which card you were looking at. And the question is, what's more simple? I can somehow see with my mind what you're seeing with your mind when we look at the card, or there's some kind of trick. I've marked the cards a certain way, or there's some type of trick that makes you think that I'm psychic. Well, Occam's Razor would say, look, it's more likely that there's a trick there, only because generally speaking, people are not psychic, right? I mean, it's an unusual thing if someone could do that. They could do all kinds of things. So the simplest explanation there would be that it would be a trick. Now, it's not to say it's impossible that someone is psychic. That's not what's being said at all. It's just to illustrate the application of the principle. Much is going to depend upon what kind of a scenario you have, and it'll be pretty fact intensive. So I'm not so much here trying to force you to always use Occam's Razor. I'm just trying to use this as an example of how it works in a certain context. So take another example, and these would be really good questions on your exam that is coming up. I show you a blurry photograph, and I think it's Bigfoot, and you think it's a black bear or brown bear or something, grizzly. Well, which explanation would be more simple? A creature that we already know exists and is alive in the region, or a creature that we don't yet know exists and has never been proven to exist, and we don't have any samples from this creature, no jawbones, no DNA, nothing like that. Which would be more simple? Well, the creature that we already know exists, right? This would be a more complex explanation because we would have to explain a lot of things about how this creature avoids detection and how it's avoided detection and so forth. So the simpler explanation there is a bear. Similarly, you could do this if you're sitting by an airport, you see a light in the sky, it's unidentified. What's going to be the more simple explanation? A plane or a flying saucer? Well, it will depend upon the facts, but generally speaking, the plane will be a more simple explanation. The reason why it's a simple explanation is we know planes exist, but the saucers, kind of the jury's out, right? So, okay, let's talk a little bit about reductios and reductio ad absurdum. This is the second part of that kind of survival guide, and it's got a really fancy name, but it's not a fancy principle. It's called reductio ad absurdum, reduction to the absurd. It's from Latin. And you can see the word absurd in there. So just that should be enough to make you remember it. But the rule is, if a claim results in an impossible consequence, then it is likely incorrect. So let me show you an example of how this would work. Suppose I believe that we didn't go to the moon, that it was a hoax and it was all engineered by NASA and so forth. This is going to bring up real problems for someone, namely that we have physical artifacts that we've brought back from the moon, and scientists have tested them, and based on their composition, they know that these things came from the moon. So they know that these rocks came from the moon, for instance. You would be reduced to this claim that somehow, right, if the moon hoax was true, somehow people were able to create or find moon rocks, and enough of them to satisfy the scientific community. That would be tough to do, right, because we brought some of that stuff back. Now, I don't know that it would necessarily be impossible, but from a practical standpoint, it would be tough, right, to do this. I mean, you might be able to look around the Earth for meteorites and stuff and maybe get a little bit, get some stuff that way, Antarctica or something, but generally speaking, that would be a ridiculous consequence. Okay, you guys, that should complete chapter 1 and 2 of the book, the lecture part anyway. I hope that's helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.